Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Symposium. We're going to get started now with panel B, which is Pandemics and Economic Policy. This will feature Professor Hemel, Casey, Abramowicz, and Kovvali. And our moderator for this panel is Aneil Kovvali, a Bigelow Teaching Fellow and lecturer at law at the University of Chicago Law School, focusing on corporate law and governance. We're so excited.
Thank you. Looking forward to these panels and these presenters. I'll briefly introduce each of our distinguished panelists. We'll then hear 10 to 15-minute presentations on each of their topics, and then close with a group question and answer session of about 15 to 20 minutes. I appreciate the warm introduction, Claire. Our presenters are going to be Daniel Hemel, who's the first presenter, professor of law and Ronald H. Coase Research Scholar at the University of Chicago. Before coming to Chicago, Professor Hemel clerked for Justice Kagan and Judges Rudin and Srinivasan. He also served as a visiting counsel for the Joint Committee on Taxation. His research covers pretty much everything, but focuses on taxation, nonprofit organizations, administrative law, and the federal courts. Our second presenter is going to be Professor Michael Abramowicz, who is the Oppenheim Professor of Law at the George Washington University Law School. Before going to GW, Professor Abramowicz was on the faculty at George Mason. He's an expert on law and economics and has published extensively in fields including insurance law, corporate law, intellectual property, civil procedure, and administrative law. Our third presenter is going to be Tony Casey. He joined the faculty of the University of Chicago as a Bigelow Fellow. From those humble origins, he's worked his way up to be the Deputy Dean, a Professor of Law, and the Faculty Director at the Center on Law and Finance. Before joining the University of Chicago, Professor Casey was a partner at Kirkland & Ellis and associate at Wachtell Lipton. His research focuses on the intersection between finance and law, including bankruptcy and on technological innovation. So with that, let's get started with our first presentation, which is by Professor Hemel. I think you're still muted. Are you?
Screen share is working?
It should.
Yes. Great. So I'll talk about the challenge of social distancing and what law and economics can possibly tell us about it. The best technology for containing the spread of COVID-19 is the same as the best technology for containing virtually every plague in human history, which is social distancing. And despite millennia of experience, we're still not very good at it. This paper tries to answer the question, why not, and looks for insights from classic theories of law and economics. So I'll argue that social distancing, or more precisely, the failure to socially distance, is a negative externalities problem. And law and economics has a lot to say about negative externalities problems. Traditional law and economics approaches to negative externalities are a relatively poor fit for social distancing. Still, economic analysis can help us understand the contours of the problem and identify potential policy levers. So I'm going to use some work that Professor Milani and I did on the immunity passport debate during the early part of the pandemic, where we tried to calculate what are the costs of getting COVID-19 in monetary terms. And it's remarkable that the early data on infection fatality rates is largely held up through the pandemic. So what we found in our pretty simple model, which is online under immunity passports and moral hazard, if you're interested. For folks in their 20s and 30s, the costs of getting COVID-19 are relatively low. For a 20-year-old, we monetized it at a little under $5,000. For a 30-year-old, a little above $11,000. And most of those are mortality costs. So the primary reason to socially distance is that if you don't, you might die. Though your chances of death at the low end of the age distribution are really quite small. The social costs of infections are quite large, and we modeled within R a reproductive number of 0.8, which is, if it were R equals 0.8, virus cases would be declining. So this is an underestimate, we think, of the costs, the social costs of infection. And here, the social costs of infection are quite large. They are larger for young people if follow-on infections are evenly distributed across the age distribution. They're larger for older people if follow-on infections are within the same age group. So we've got a gap between the private costs and the social costs of failure to distance. And this is exactly what law and economics has been dealing with for the last century, right? A negative externality problem. And we've got some traditional tools. One is ex post liability. Another is ex ante taxes. And law and economics is responding to the view that the best approach is command and control. Ex post liability doesn't work very well in this context for three reasons. One, it's not easy to observe who is spreading infections across the population. We probably want people who are infected to tell us rather than not wanting to tell us because they don't want us to impose liability on them. There's a time inconsistency problem. We can say we'll hit you with huge penalties if you fail to distance, but we're probably not going to do that to sick people. Another potential approach is ex ante taxes on failure to distance. So we could raise taxes on indoor dining restaurants, bars, gyms, and movie theaters. This wouldn't be that bad of an idea. There's a political problem with it. There's still the observability challenge that a lot of failures to distance aren't in public places, they're in private homes. And then another approach would be command and control. We don't need to tax the bars, we could just shut down the bars. A few thoughts on command and control approaches. Command and control doesn't need to be one size fits all. It's best when it's not one size fits all. We're doing this kind of crazy thing in Illinois where we think that all of society should move together. I.e., when we're opening more bars, we open more schools, which is the opposite of what England is doing. England is closing the bars and keeping the schools open, which is kind of a sensible thing to do. I never thought that I would appeal to Boris Johnson as a voice of reason. But you can think of this as a variant of the prisoner's dilemma problem. It's the distancer's dilemma. If the schools are open and the bars are closed, that's great, particularly for the children and the teachers. If the schools are open and the bars are open, that's okay for the bars and really bad for less for the children, more for the teachers, because there's more virus out there in the population and they're more likely to contract it. If the schools are closed and the bars are open, that's pretty good for the bars. And if the bars are closed and the schools are closed, everyone's at zero. Totally rational what the bars are doing. Their best move is to open under every scenario. And it's understandable that Chicago teachers don't want to open schools when infection rates are really high. Right? So it would be great if we could have the government come in and close the bars and open the schools. Instead, we are doing the opposite in Chicago right now. So there's an opportunity for an intersectoral Coasian bargain. Basically, parents should go into bars and pay the bars to close down. That's what a political system ideally would be doing. All right, so our traditional law and economics tools don't help us all that much, but can Chicago-style economic analysis offer us any insights about the determinants of distancing and policy tools that might be able to influence behavior? I think the answer is yes. I'm going to write a really simple model of distancing. In each period, you choose whether to distance or not to distance. There's some value, either financial or social, in not distancing. But failure to distance raises the probability of an infection from PD to BN, and there's some harm from infection. So you distance if the harm avoidance benefits exceed the economic or social costs, i.e. you don't distance if the economic or social benefits exceed the COVID-19 harm costs. And I think that's probably an equation that most of us have thought through in our minds before in deciding like whether to get a haircut. My answer is clearly no. So what determines the difference between PN and PD? The probability of getting the virus when you don't distance and the probability of getting the virus when you do. Well, you would think that as the prevalence of virus goes up, PN minus PD would go up. It's actually theoretically ambiguous because prevalence raises PN, but it also raises PD. There's something quasi-rational to virus defeatism, to thinking there's so much virus around that I'm going to get it anyway, so why not go out to the bar? It's pretty clear that the longer the pandemic lasts, the higher PD is, right? So if we knew that this was going to last for the next 5 years, I think most of us would just give up and go back to normally scheduled programming. Is there anything we can do about PN minus PD to encourage distancing? We can end the pandemic sooner, of course. We can make people believe that the pandemic will end sooner. The sooner you think the pandemic will end, the more rational distancing is, because the less likely you are to get the virus staying home. So vaccines can save lives, potentially even before they arrive. The policy implications from this aren't crystal clear. You probably can fool all of the people some of the time. So if we could convince people, vaccine optimism is one of the few things that's rational about Trump's virus PR strategy. The other elements aren't in place, but we do want people to think that a vaccine is coming relatively soon so as to stave off virus defeatism. So what determines VN minus VD, the difference between not distancing and distancing in value terms? Taxes and transfers can help. So early in the pandemic, we had a greater than 100% tax rate in some occupations. You made more money by being on unemployment insurance than by working. This is from work, actually not across the Midway, next door over at Harris by Peter Ganong and co-authors about the replacement rate of unemployment insurance. And in some industries, food service being an example, people raised their income by more than 50% by being on unemployment insurance relative to working. That was only when they were getting a $600 federal supplement, which has run out. This actually kind of makes sense from an intersectoral Coasian bargaining perspective. We were basically paying off the bartenders and the waiters to stay home early on in the pandemic, but we didn't ultimately sustain that. In addition to taxes and transfers, we could try to make distancing more pleasant. We could raise VD. One way to do this is universal basic income and unemployment insurance, right? Andrew Yang thought that the robots would come and take our jobs, but in fact, the virus came and took our jobs. But there are other ways that we can raise the floor, make VD more attractive. We can subsidize complements to distancing. This is really a classic public finance solution. If we want to get people to work more, we subsidize public transit and childcare because those are things that are more valuable when you're working. We could subsidize complements to distancing, affordable housing being one of them. Distancing is more pleasant when you have a nicer place to live. That's hard to ramp up in a pandemic, but if we're thinking of policy justifications for affordable housing, pandemics are actually a pretty good one for that, especially realizing that this is probably not the last one that the United States will face. Another one, and this is semi-serious, and actually more emphasis on the serious than on the semi. It wouldn't be crazy for the federal government, I think, to get everyone in America a free Netflix subscription right now. So here's the thinking. We know that a lot more people are watching Netflix during the pandemic. Netflix is a complement to distancing. That's why Netflix stock price is up 70% since the start of the pandemic. But there are a lot of Americans who aren't watching Netflix because they don't have it. So there are 56 million non-subscriber households. And if we just bought them subscriptions for $8.99 a month, and I assume Netflix would give us a discount, that's something like $500 million a month out of the federal government. There are 30,000 deaths per month in the US. So if Netflix for All reduced transmission by 0.2%, it would pay for itself at a $10 million value of a statistical life, which is what we generally use in cost-benefit analysis. And I think that's really overestimating the costs of Netflix for All or underestimating the benefits, because that's just looking at the health benefits of Netflix. But there are also the benefits to the people without Netflix who then got to watch British baking shows as a result of free Netflix for all. So this is something that would be pretty easy to ramp up in a pandemic, and I think would have non-trivial public health consequences. And even if the public health consequences were almost trivial relative to the cost, it would be a good deal for society. So summing up, the most effective technology for controlling a pandemic is a very low-tech technology, distancing. There's a misalignment between private incentives and social objectives with respect to distancing. This is like the core problem of law and economics. Law and economics can shed light on the problem, though standard tools of L&E don't seem to work very well. There's an important role for the government in coordinating across sectors, potentially in facilitating intersectoral Coasian bargains, and in subsidizing complements to distancing. Thanks.
Thank you for a really great presentation, managing to deputize Trump, Johnson, and Yang into your argument. So on to our next presentation, Professor Abramowicz.
Let me see if I can share my screen here. Where is it? That's weird. Oh, let's see. Sorry, 1 second. I have my presentation up, but it's not coming up on my list. Oh, I see. Show all windows. That'll do it. Ah. Okay. Can you see my presentation? Okay, great. Okay, so unfortunately, I can't offer everyone free HBO, but what I do want to talk about is the possibility of a kind of insurance that we really didn't see in this pandemic, but that might have been very useful if we had. So let's imagine that we're in some kind of hypothetical parallel universe where essentially everyone had insurance for most of the economic losses, not all, but associated with the pandemic. Well, then I think, we wouldn't have needed federal legislation. Everyone would have been, worse off to some extent, right? Because not all of your economic losses would be covered, but the losses would be spread more evenly. We assume there's some counterparties there that were willing to take the risk that this pandemic insurance would pay out. They would lose, of course, but the people who are in the best position to do that will tend to be the relatively well off. So the question arises, well, why do we have this missing market, right? It seems like it might be nice if we had some kind of insurance like this, and yet we don't. When we think about business interruption policies, for example, business interruption policies have been held, I think correctly, looking at the text of these policies, not to cover pandemics for the most part. A few people had coverage. Wimbledon had some coverage, but for the most part, there isn't very much coverage. And part of the answer to this, I think, is pretty clearly measurement difficulty, right? It's very difficult to actually figure out what did any particular individual suffer as a result of the pandemic. And anticipating this, it's very hard to get markets going. And this is not only hard for private insurance, it's also very hard for social insurance. And so the result of all this is that we ended up with kind of a very crude substitute of social insurance, which Daniel talked a little bit about. We had cash payments, unemployment extensions, and things of that sort, but not really, not even doing a very good job of that. What you might have thought at least that we would look to see, how did people's income change from the previous year to the present year? That would have allowed us to have a more tailored solution. We didn't even do that, right? Once politics enters into things, it's going to be hard to even have a good kind of ex post public insurance response, even if things were measurable. And so the question is, well, is there something else out there that might have been useful? And there is an idea that I didn't come up with, but that one might think would actually have been fairly useful if it were widespread. And this is the Nobel laureate Robert Shiller's idea of livelihood insurance. And the key thing is that this is insurance not based on your own, for the most part, based on your own wage, whether your own wage or income falls or not, but it's on the income of a group of people. So just as an example, let's imagine that lots of restaurant servers, waiters, waitresses, and so forth, purchased restaurant server insurance, okay? Because they said, well, maybe there's some small chance that all of our livelihood is going to go down at the same time. And maybe the policies, for example, might provide something like, if restaurant servers' incomes fall relative to the average income, more than, let's say, 10% over the relevant period, then some percentage of that shortfall would be covered by the insurance. Well, the really nice thing, I mean, the problem with this, of course, is you might say, well, we really like insurance to measure individual loss. Okay, so that's something this doesn't do. But the nice thing about this is that it overcomes sort of the two fundamental problems with insurance. So first of all, there's no moral hazard. The insurance pays regardless of whether somebody has been infected, whether their own wage falls. And that means that to the extent that there are individuals who can adapt relatively easily to other jobs, for example, they'll have an incentive to do so, right? Regardless of whether your insurance policy is going to pay out. If you can move from working in a restaurant, I don't know, to grocery delivery or something like that, and let's suppose that makes up some percentage of your income, you'll have an incentive to do that. And that'll automatically feed back into the recovery that all the restaurant servers receive. So since your own loss doesn't affect what you're going to get paid on the insurance, there's no moral hazard. And there's not really there's not really an adverse selection problem either. It's true, maybe people with with the greatest, most volatile livelihoods might be most likely to buy this insurance, but the kind of insurance you'd want to get is going to be something tailored to your own individual, your own kind of profession, and you're not going to get some special payout because you're individually more vulnerable to loss. So we lose something in particularity, but there's a lot of value to this idea of insurance that's general, and that I think could have made a big difference in this pandemic. And I think it's possible to generalize this across a lot of problems that we face beyond pandemics. Well, first of all, within pandemics, we need to recognize that there's not just differential impact by job, but it could be by region. Obviously, this was worldwide, but that might not be true for every epidemic that we face. And there could be other variables as well, that affect which groups are correlated. And so if you had lots of different people buying, kind of associating with their lot, in a sense, with different groups, their profession, their region, and so forth, that could help smooth out income. You could think about this for something like flooding and other natural disasters as well. Complication here is we're not really just worried about income. We're worried more about wealth in the form of homes. And so it becomes a little harder to construct an index of what people have lost. But you could imagine the government trying to, measuring, let's say, some percentage loss from some percentage of people who held a particular kind of policy. And then you'd have a policy that would pay out based on that. Now here there might be, right here you can see a little more the loss from not having your own individual losses considered, right? There could be somebody who's in a floodplain, but for whatever random reason, their house remains unscathed. And so they receive a recovery on the insurance. At the same time, there's benefits from avoiding the need for kind of individual adjudication and assessment by insurance companies of what the loss is. And then, of course, you could take this to climate change, which is kind of like natural disasters, but over a much longer time horizon. And we could have indices of what happens in particular regions. Do people who own real estate near the coast, for example, are they likely to suffer more than others? If so, they could buy some financial products for that. And that's actually kind of bordering on an area where we actually do have this. So you can also think about this just for economic performance, right? Apart from disasters, there are lots of changes in the economy. So Schiller actually gives this example of, well, suppose you've decided to devote your life to the study of kind of recombinant DNA, is the phrase that he uses. Well, what happens if it turns out that doesn't amount to much? Or I guess, CRISPR would be maybe the equivalent if you decide to invest all, your resources in CRISPR, and then it turns out CRISPR is kind of a big disappointment. You're not going to do too well in your career. So maybe you should insure against that by, buying something that's tracked to all the people who have made a similar decision to you. Another example is people who are maybe Uber and Lyft drivers, and maybe they have some vulnerability to the possibility of automation. So they might like to have an insurance product based on this. And you can also think about kind of regional economic performance. So, maybe you think, I don't know, Detroit is reviving. You're willing to kind of put your lot there, but there's some risk in that, obviously. And so you might want to insure against that. And we could think about national economic performance, right? Here the idea would really be to reduce macroeconomic fluctuations. If we imagine that everybody in Greece had this insurance, maybe things wouldn't have been so bad there. Maybe you can even think about global. The problem is, of course, somebody's got to bear the other side of the deal. But again, that counterparty might be kind of a relatively wealthy person who's willing to say, yeah, I'll get a high payout in good years. And then if there's some bad years for the world, well, then I'll lose a lot in those years. And so that could kind of be, be a useful kind of redistribution. Okay, so why don't we have this, seemingly very useful type of insurance? And I think there's, a number of reasons. First of all, we actually need to collect the data. And Shareholder makes this point. Shareholder says, look, maybe one role for the government is actually in data collection, right? We need to construct these indices. It doesn't seem like it should be that hard, right? To look at, well, how is the income of, I don't know, restaurant servers falling, or restaurant owners, or, whatever the group is we're talking about. But right now, I think it would be a significant obstacle to this insurance getting off the ground. Another problem might be sort of the problem of relative income. So one thing we see with flood insurance, flood insurance is actually pretty heavily subsidized in some places, and yet we still have very low uptake of the insurance. And sort of the question is why? And I think there's a couple answers. Maybe one is that people don't want to insure things so much that are affecting everyone around them equally, right? To the extent that we care about our relative income to those around us, you might say, well, in a sense, these kind of correlated welfare losses aren't that big a problem. As long as we're all suffering together, maybe we're not so upset, and so maybe people don't buy the insurance. Now, if that's the answer, maybe then we shouldn't have this, right? We should say, well, it's not so harmful in a sense when everybody is kind of mutually suffering. But I think another piece of what's going on with flood insurance, and that would certainly be a problem here as well, is that consumers don't have relatively good information about how to assess, how to determine if the insurance is a good deal, right? Some experts can say, oh, no, you really should buy this, but they're not so sure, and they don't know how to assess that. And then which products to buy, who to buy it from, in what amounts, over what time horizon. And then you can flip to the side of the producers, and they face a lot of market uncertainty. So, if you're considering offering livelihood insurance, it's a pretty good chance this market is never going to get off the ground. And moreover, if it does get off the ground, if you prove that there's a viable market, there's, you don't have such great network externalities here. And so there's a good chance that some other, bigger providers are going to come in and swoop away your customers. So to the extent that we need people to do market experiments to try to advertise this, convince people to do it, there's not that much incentive to do it, because if you're successful, you're not necessarily going to keep your own business. So one possibility, that one might imagine, I don't think this is going to happen, is some kind of mandatory insurance, right? And mandatory insurance solves a lot of problems in a lot of contexts, adverse selection, and so on. And if everyone were required to buy the insurance, then let's assume that we can actually enforce it with some kind of tax or fee. I guess the Supreme Court can debate which it is. But I think there are a couple of big problems here with that. One of them is the problem that if we just say, well, everyone has to, let's say, spend 5% of their income or 10% of their income on this kind of insurance, you still have to sort of pick like which group insurance you want. And if you don't want the insurance, you might just sort of try to pick a group that has very broad exposure, a very broad group. Instead of going with the restaurant servers, you might go with a broad group where you can be pretty sure that the payoff is going to be close to 100% each year, pandemic or not, right? So, in effect, you can have an insurance product that's not really an insurance product. It just pays you the money back. And this is an issue with health insurance as well. We can say mandatory health insurance, but if we don't regulate it, people might buy things that don't really look like insurance products. And then the second problem is, well, some people need more of this insurance than others, right? Those Uber and Lyft drivers need more protection against sectoral change and technological change than some other people. So if you really wanted a mandate, ideally, you'd really need the government to say, okay, you need to buy this kind of insurance, and this is the amount. At this point, it becomes a little bit too intrusive. So I do think there are some more modest roles for the government here. And one of them is just the possibility of focusing on information collection and distribution. As Schiller suggested, where we could ask some questions on the tax form, to figure out, what groups people are associated with. We could report, how that welfare changes over time. We could also use prediction markets to kind of forecast, well, what's the chance that there might be changes? That might provide information back to individuals and to insurers to kind of help them make reasonable ex ante deals. You also might try to get people together and serve as a kind of market maker. So if we're using prediction markets, we could use prediction markets essentially as a way of forecasting, well, what will the income be of people in these, in different groups, like let's say restaurant servers again. And so that, again, that provides information, but we could also then use that as a kind of vehicle for subsidization. So you can have a kind of, what's called an automated market maker rule by which the government can kind of subsidize these markets and create liquidity, right? So you might say, look, we don't need complicated insurance companies. All we need are, some markets that we could run online where people can buy these products and sell these products. And all we really need is for the government to serve a market maker role rather than be the insurer. And another possibility is to sort of, that kind of transitions to the next possibility, which is a market subsidizer. And I think the purpose here really is to jumpstart these markets rather than maintaining them. So for example, you might imagine that the government would say, look, we're going to provide large subsidies, but these subsidies are going to go away if the market gets sufficiently large. If the market is large, you don't need us anymore. The problem is getting this going to the point where people think of this as a normal kind of financial product and use it. And you could also try to target the subsidies based on the degree of uncertainty about expected insurance payouts, right? Addressing this kind of problem that I talked about before with, people might have an incentive just to put their money, if they're required to just put their money in an insurance that just always gives them the money back. Especially if you wanted to get into government mandates or government subsidies, then government should target it at things where this seems like it's a genuine insurance product, and you could use prediction markets to forecast, well, what's the probability this pays out? What's the probability it doesn't pay out? And so without the government making individual assessments, we could still figure out where the government should target its money. And so part of what I'm really trying to do is talk about how kind of, relatively simple market mechanisms targeted at individual insurance products could provide us a lot of information that might help consumers make more informed decisions about these things. Now, you could also imagine actually using prediction markets for individual consumers, right? So to actually say like, well, okay, if you choose this insurer, and I'm not going to get into the mechanisms of prediction markets here, but you can have a market where third parties have an incentive essentially to say, look, consumer, if you choose this insurance product, this is the distribution of your outcomes that we can expect over time. And if you don't choose it, here's the other distribution. So consumers can kind of get some sense, right? So they can get better information about whether to buy things. How much should you invest in this? And, in this world, the government's role is not to be social insurer. It's not even really to regulate the private insurance markets so much as just to kind of help run these and regulate and subsidize some of these prediction markets to provide better information for consumers about what kinds of insurance policies to buy. And that might include ordinary insurance as well as this kind of livelihood insurance. And presumably some combination makes sense depending on the problem that we need to address. In the long run, if that were common, maybe we could think about government mandates, but I think that's a ways off. So I think that's a good place to stop, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Abramowicz. Professor Casey?
I guess I have to.
I'm not sure if it's just me, but I'm actually having trouble hearing you, Professor Casey.
Is that better?
Yes.
All right. Sorry about that. I apologize. All right. So I was saying my paper somewhat relates to Michael's talk, but I'm taking it a level higher and thinking about kind of the systemic and macro issues. And so I want to focus on the role that a government and law can play in responding to the crisis from economic and financial distress from a pandemic. So I come to this topic from someone who's written about and thought about bailouts and bankruptcy law, both of which have been front and center in the dialogue during the pandemic, although bankruptcy law has not actually played a role in what's been implemented. So bailouts have been, but bankruptcy law has been just talked about. And I want to discuss why that is. The project's not one of specific proposals, but rather thinking of a framework that'll help us assess what's been done, what's been proposed, and to the theme, thinking about lessons for the next pandemic. One big caveat is it's still running, the pandemic's still running its course. The economic effects haven't fully played out. And so many of the lessons are unknown or tentative, but I want to kind of address the questions we want to ask as we watch this play out. All right, so there's a lot that's going to be in the paper about every various tool you can use in responding to the crisis. I want to keep this at a high level and give a framework and then talk in particular detail about the bankruptcy tool. All right, so the big picture, high level point I want to make is really somewhat obvious, and it's something like this. You can't understand the right tool in a crisis, and here I meant like dealing with the market effects of a crisis, economic or financial, until you do two things. You understand the nature of that crisis, and you understand the purpose that the government is, why the government's responding to it. Why is the government taking action in responding to this crisis? And right, as obvious as that may seem, I think it's been forgotten a little in the debates and application throughout the last 7 months. So to give an example of what I mean, you might have a banking crisis like in 2008 that threatens the liquidity of financial markets. Or you might have an economic crisis that threatens to leave 30 million people unemployed. And your response to those two crises will be different. You might have both at the same time. And once you determine which one you have or what the nature of the combination is, then you have to decide what you're trying to do. Are you trying to restore in a financial crisis liquidity and stop a spread? Or are you just trying to compensate those who are affected? In the economic shock, are you trying to stop the shock from spreading? Or I think a lot what Michael was talking about, are you trying to compensate people who've lost because of the shock, right? Giving a kind of insurance after the fact. So you want to answer those questions and then you'll see the tools. And so I'll just share one slide. Here we go. All right, does everyone see that slide? All right, so the very simple version of what I want to say is the tools the government has and the things it responds to really fall into these two dimensions, right? The problem can be systemic or specific. By systemic, I mean it's both widespread and spreading, right? It's not enough for it to be throughout the market. It's that there's a risk that distress with one firm causes distress with another firm. Or it can be specific, which is really, you're worried about one firm or groups of firms, but their own distress doesn't have a risk of spreading. So you can have widespread, specific distress if every little silo is contained. And then that's like the scope. But then you can have two different types. So there's financial distress, and I use that in a term that's familiar to bankruptcy scholars to mean a firm will have projects that are profitable, but it might not be able to finance them. Or an economy might be producing, but now projects can't get liquidity, can't get funding, even though they're valuable. That's financial distress. So specific financial distress would be, I can't get a loan for a project that would pay off the loan. It's really a profitable project. Systemic financial distress would be like 2008, where the banks have illiquidity and that threatens to shut down more. By economic distress, I mean like the real economy. So firms, no one wants to buy your widgets anymore. So specific economic distress would be your business is failing, not because you can't get financing, but because there's something wrong with it or there was some shock that hit it. Now, systemic economic distress would be the same thing, but where there's spillover effects and one firm's distress, right? If this firm shuts down, they'll stop buying from this firm, their employees will stop buying from that firm, and it starts spreading and has externality and market effects, right? Those are the two dimensions, and you get these four buckets. And to simplify, each bucket has its own legal tool to respond to it. And so I'll talk about those briefly, but I really want to focus on two of them more than the others, right? So specific economic distress is that bottom right-hand corner, right? And that's like direct subsidies. That's what Michael was talking about. That's not a crisis in the way the others might be, because we're not worried about the spread. We're just worried about like these people or firms have had a hardship and there might be moral or political reasons we want to compensate them. Or, you know, like the market doesn't work, they couldn't buy insurance, we want to step in. There's different considerations there than in the systemic crisis version, because we don't have to act right now. We want to act quickly to reduce the hardship, but there's not the spread problem. All right, that's that bucket, and I'll move on from that. In the kind of pandemic, the bucket where we talk about systemic economic crisis is really important, and I think especially the focus the government wants to think about. So normally we think of like a domino effect. One firm goes down, another firm goes down. And so that spread. So you can imagine all the firms that were shut down, you know, they then didn't buy from other firms that might not have been shut down, but the distress spreads throughout the economy. That's the traditional way of thinking about it. There's another problem that might come up, and this is what I'll call like the deepening of distress. So imagine there's a restaurant in New York and it's shut down because of either demand is down or a government shutdown. And it runs out of money, so it closes its doors. It can't pay its loans, can't pay its rent, can't pay its workers, it shuts down. There's a cost to shutting down. And here's something somewhat peculiar to a pandemic. We don't know how permanent or how long that will be. So a year from now, hopefully, right, demand for that restaurant's back, but it's shut down for a year. So now a new restaurant comes into the same spot, gets a new lease, gets a new bank, hires new employees. And there's all these costs to shutting down and then starting back up. And so you might think, in retrospect, it would have been cheaper for society to have subsidized that restaurant to stay open but do nothing, so that the building didn't go dormant, so that the workers didn't find new jobs. And so it might be cheaper to do that kind of as a kind of general economic matter than to shut down and start up again, because shutting down and starting up is costly. And if that's true, and I'll pause it, I think the evidence in kind of what the economists have seen in the last few months is that is true, especially for smaller businesses. For larger businesses, they're likely to be here at the end, right? So even if the airlines are shut down, even if they're owned by a different shareholder, those planes are going to be here. But lots of businesses in New York are gone, and they're gone for good. And there might be more in the next few months. And I use New York because they were kind of the first to feel the biggest effect. So what do you want to do? You want to potentially subsidize them, but there's three real problems for the government there. Right? We don't know how long the pandemic is going to last. So it's hard to balance the cost of shutdown versus the cost of subsidy. We don't know if demand is actually going to recover and look like it did pre-pandemic, right? People's behavior might be permanently changed. And then we don't know if this firm is actually a firm that is being hurt because of the pandemic, or it was going to go out of business anyway, and we don't really want to prop it up. The challenge for the government is asking those questions. And here's where the lessons are tentative, because I don't think we've seen a good way of answering those questions. It might be that if it's too costly to answer those questions, you want subsidies, general subsidies that are industry-wide to groups of small businesses, because it's not worth it to figure out which companies are the ones you should provide it to, the subsidies to. And you can think of the Paycheck Protection Program as something like that. Not nearly as broad as you might want it to be, but it was grants, loans forgivable loans to particular businesses to keep them open. And the economists are already looking to see if this was a effective cost benefit analysis makes it a good idea. Some people say that the PPP program saved 3 million jobs already, right? That's the benefit. And then you have to look at how much the cost was worth it. So that's that bottom left-hand general subsidies for systemic economic crisis. Then there's systemic financial distress. And I won't say a lot here today because a lot has been written about that. Eric Posner and I wrote about that in connection with 2008. The government has a major role to play in injecting liquidity when financial markets are shutting down systemically. And they need to balance efficiency, fairness, moral hazard, administrative costs in doing that. In a pandemic, I think the bigger crisis will be the economic distress, but certainly that has a risk of working its way into the center and creating financial distress. In this particular instance, the government, the Fed in particular, was very quick and decisive in acting, right? So they responded to a potential financial crisis and it's estimated they injected somewhere over $2 trillion into the markets already. And so we didn't see a financial crisis. We probably would have seen something. Maybe we don't know how bad it would have been, but they reacted very quickly. And so that's that bucket. And here I'll finish up and spend probably the most time on bankruptcy law. And I put that in that top right corner, being about specific financial distress. And by putting it there, I kind of that's my conclusion that I think is a little controversial, but it wasn't before the pandemic. So what good does bankruptcy law do? There's really two questions to ask. Can it address a crisis like this? And how does this crisis affect the operation of bankruptcy law? So to the first question, when I put it in the specific financial distress bucket, I'm kind of saying it cannot address this crisis. And it's been conventional wisdom that bankruptcy, Chapter 11, is a form of reorganization for firms, individual firms with financial distress. That's what it does. That's why we have it. At the beginning of the pandemic, people started debating how it should be tweaked or reformed to deal with the pandemic. And there was a lot of proposal, a lot of disagreement. And it isn't a crisis mechanism. It's not a systemic mechanism. It's not an economic mechanism. And so, for example, there were proposals that said we should inject liquidity at the bankruptcy point. We should provide a fund that finances firms when they file for bankruptcy. That really is getting the analysis wrong, because if you think there's a liquidity problem, there's no reason to only favor firms once they file for bankruptcy. You want to favor them in the economy. Distressed firms don't always file. Sometimes they go out of business. Sometimes they try to work it out outside of bankruptcy. Sometimes bankruptcy is too late. So liquidity injection should come market-wide, not just in bankruptcy. The flip side is also true. It shouldn't be excluded in bankruptcy, which the PPP actually was. So that was a problem. And that is a problem with some of the reforms. Liquidity should be across the board, in and out of bankruptcy. So those proposals are kind of wrongly targeted. They're missing the idea that bankruptcy is not systemic. It's also not economic. Bankruptcy cannot create new demand. The process doesn't do that. It doesn't pay your future bills while you're shut down. That's not a thing that bankruptcy can accomplish. It can reorganize your capital structure for a business that's profitable. And so it's not going to address even specific economic distress, right? Which is to say it's not a tool for the crisis. But firms will file for bankruptcy because they'll be in distress. And then the question is, well, what impact does the pandemic have on bankruptcy? And so at the beginning of the crisis, there was a general agreement among bankruptcy experts that there was a wave of bankruptcy coming, and it was gonna really put a pressure on the court. So one of the reform proposals was we should expand the resources of bankruptcy courts, because when all these firms file for bankruptcy, the courts won't be able to handle it, and individuals. What's happened is that wave never showed up, right? In fact, individual bankruptcies are down, medium-sized bankruptcies are static or down. Mega bankruptcies, huge companies, are slightly up, but not in a way that's gonna kind of stress the court. And those are all gonna go to 3 courts anyway, the way bankruptcy filings happen. So we don't have this wave, but that's not good news. And the reason I say that is because bankruptcy is not a solution for economic distress, all these small businesses might just be going out of business, right? They might not be filing. Or the day of reckoning might be pushed down the road for when PPP funds are expended. And then you'll have filings, but when small businesses file for Chapter 11, they usually convert to 7 and then go out of business. And so the lack of a wave is not a good sign, right? It's not a bad sign or a good sign. It's a neutral sign. So, and I'll end with this, then that suggests we want to at least think about judicial resources. But here's the weird thing about all of it. the people proposing that we should expand the bankruptcy courts because there's all these small business bankruptcies coming, right? The way they're thinking about it is there's a wave of bankruptcies that bankruptcy law doesn't do a good job handling. So there's going to be these hopeless small business filings that are going to kind of swamp the court. And we see that wave coming, and it's a little strange to say, what should we do? Well, we should get more judges to process those hopeless cases, right? If we have the foresight now to see the wave of economic distress coming, right, and the political ability to do something about it, which we may or may not, it's odd to say, let's prepare for the wave rather than let's stop the wave. And so if the choice is 100 more bankruptcy judges or double PPP, we should double PPP, right? 3 million jobs, make it 6 million jobs. And that's what I mean when I say in responding to a crisis, we should really focus on what problem are we trying to solve and what tools make sense with it. And so bankruptcy is a tool for financial distress. We need to make sure it's working, but it's not the crisis solution, right? These small business grants, these small business programs are the solution, and we want more of that, and that should be the focus. So that's, I'll end it with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Casey. I have a presentation on my topic, which is essential businesses, and then we'll turn to some questions. My topic is essential businesses and shareholder value. I just wanted to start with the observation that it's a little bit surprising or weird that there is such a thing as an essential business. If you stop and think about it, we're faced with a global crisis, a huge number of fatalities. Governments around the world are stepping up and taking responsibility for the lives of their citizens. And in our society, we made a determination that it was absolutely essential for certain for-profit companies to continue to operate. Because if those for-profit companies stopped operating, we would not survive as a society. And if you stop and think about that and how frightening that is, you realize how much our survival in a crisis depends on the decisions that are being made by these private actors, both ex ante and ex post. It becomes necessary to think seriously about whether they're making the right decisions and whether they have the right incentives to make good decisions. And I want to suggest to you that there are some reasons for concern about that. And by pointing to two types of problems that we've seen over the course of the COVID crisis. First, we've seen that many businesses are not set up to operate safely in a crisis. The only way that they could operate was by exposing third parties to risk. You know, they had facilities that made it impossible to engage in social distancing. They didn't have sick leave policies, etc. Second, businesses were often set up not to, in a way that didn't allow them to operate reliably in a crisis. They had brittle supply chains. They themselves had a small number of facilities that they were critically dependent on, creating supply chain effects downstream. These problems are related to each other through at least two mechanisms. And the first is moral hazard. If you arrange things so that you have a facility that is critical to the supply of some essential item, you can count on the government to do what is needed to keep that facility open, even if operating that facility creates huge externalities. There's a more fundamental relationship between the two problems because they're both symptoms of the same underlying issue, which is business decisions that were made to optimize profits in a specific operating environment, without adequate attention being paid to the risk of deviations from that environment over the longer term. And as a motivating example, what I would point to is meat processing in the United States and its initial response to the crisis. So meat, as a result of decades of consolidation, most of this country's meat supply is processed at a small group of slaughterhouses, mostly clustered in the Midwest. That in itself raises concerns because it makes the nation's meat supply critically dependent on a small number of facilities, as much smaller number of facilities than there were before that wave of consolidation. Even before those crises, those slaughterhouses were drawing criticism as being potentially unsafe places for workers. So even before COVID, it was dangerous to have workers standing right next to each other, wielding knives and trying to cut up meat without being adequately separated, and while the line is processing meat at an incredible rate. The slaughterhouses themselves were also critically dependent on inputs being in a certain form. If you're a pig farmer and your pig grows a little bit too big, you can't sell it to the slaughterhouse anymore. It doesn't fit. And as a result, we've seen a wave of euthanasia in which animals are being put down. As the pandemic began to take hold, these design choices led to serious problems. Large numbers of workers started getting sick. and as a result, plants started to get shut down. The result was a major disruption to the meat supply, both upstream, farmers weren't able to sell to these plants, and downstream, in that consumers weren't able to receive the meat that they'd come to expect. This resulted in a major public and private lobbying campaign by meat suppliers. The most prominent example of this was Tyson taking out an ad in the New York Times and other media outlets, basically saying that the supply chain was in danger. President Trump immediately swung into action, issuing an executive order saying these are critical facilities and asserting a federal role in determining whether they remain open. And eventually the plants did come back open. So that's a problem that I'm trying to focus on. Might pause for a second and ask, why is this a corporate governance problem? And what I'd suggest to you is that the underlying issue was a lack of attention to this.
Hold on.
I'm sorry, would you mind muting yourself?
Oh, trying to figure out how to turn it off. Okay, I apologize.
Thanks. Not a problem. The underlying issue here was really an inattention to risk and a focus on short-term profitability over long-term viability. And that's a very typical corporate governance kind of concern. The issue also relates very closely to the ways that companies shape and respond to external constraints like regulation. There are also various corporate governance mechanisms that are supposed to speak to these kinds of concerns. Directors and officers are supposed to monitor risk, and they're supposed to be attentive to these kinds of issues. So there very much seems to be a role for corporate governance to play. I might still pause and say, why corporate governance? Why not an external regulatory strategy? Why not, specify in regulation that slaughterhouses need to be arranged in a particular way? And my first caution is just, I'm not opposed to that external regulatory strategy. I'm all in favor of it, in fact. I would suggest, though, that corporate governance can play a useful role in supporting that strategy, both in terms of making the regulations more effective and building on those regulations. And the reason why is that corporations have a critical role to play in the shaping of those regulations. They can change the costs involved in setting a more stringent standard. If you lay out a plant and it's laid out in such a way as to be barely compliant with existing law, and it's hugely expensive to change to set a higher standard, you've changed the cost or benefit of a more stringent rule. You also can change the political economy of new rulemaking, because if you create a situation where corporations are eager for regulation, they're looking for regulation that gives them guidance about how they're supposed to manage particular risks and provide safe harbors, you're more likely to see that lobbying strength of corporations to be put to use to encourage regulators to act. And similarly, if you apply, if you make corporations that are public subject to these kinds of requirements, they'll be eager for regulations to apply to all of their competitors, both small and foreign and privately held. Finally, there's a missed opportunity if we pursue an exclusively external strategy, because again, there are structures that are in place that are supposed to be responsive to these kinds of concerns. We have directors and officers who have a huge amount of information about operations of their particular firms and about their firm's risks, and that should be able to play a useful and constructive role. So how can corporate governance do better? Let's say you're sold on the idea that there's a problem here. My honest answer here is that I'm a lot less confident of the solution than of the problem. But one approach would be to adopt some ideas that were first championed by John Armour and Jeff Gordon in the wake of the financial crisis. What they suggested was a liability regime for systemically important financial firms. They rejected it for non-financial firms for a variety of reasons. But applying a liability regime here might be quite valuable. If we targeted firms that are operating essential businesses, we might be able to encourage directors and officers to take better account of the risks that are involved in their operations and the way that they structure. There are obviously a lot of dimensions to what a liability regime should look like. And a first question might be, what firms should we target? For purposes of our analysis, I would suggest that what we really ought to be doing is targeting large firms that have operated essential businesses, that are operating essential businesses. Now, this may not be an easy standard to apply. Unlike systemically important financial institutions, these aren't necessarily designated in advance. You don't necessarily have the same sort of nexus of regulators who are preparing lists of companies to be focused on. You don't necessarily know that you're running an essential business in advance. But I'd suggest that that concern about uncertainty is mitigated for a variety of reasons. The first is that we have the COVID experience. We know what businesses were deemed essential in the wake of this particular crisis. And so people who are running those businesses know them right now. We also have other bodies of law that even existed before COVID. So for example, cross-border M&A. If foreign companies or if a foreign acquirer wanted to buy a US business, that transaction is often subject to review by the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. That type of review is focused on the national security concerns about having critical assets being in the hands of foreigners, potentially foreign adversaries. And lawyers, even before the crisis, were aware of this institution and were aware of this process and could opine intelligently about whether a particular transaction would raise CFIUS national security concerns. There are also other bodies of law to draw on, such as Department of Homeland Security guidance on critical infrastructure. Also, uncertainty could be put to work. We might treat a company's acceptance of a bailout as sort of conclusive evidence or a conclusive stipulation that it is essential, for example. And if uncertainty is really too much of a problem, if that's your objection to the liability regime, we could always designate firms in advance. And also suggest that the defendants of these actions should be directors and officers as opposed to the firms themselves. Targeting a firm itself creates the risk of disrupting essential activities. In order to really create a deterrent effect for the overall firm, there would need to be a huge liability at stake. That might be something that could cause a real problem in terms of their ability to continue to function and play their essential role in the midst of a crisis. Directors and officers who already have an obligation to monitor risks and who are natural persons who are subject to being incentivized by much smaller monetary amounts are a natural target. The next question is, who should be the plaintiffs? Now, I really have one no and a bunch of potential yeses. The one no is it should not be liability that's in the hands of the government or government agencies, because there's a real risk that the government will simply bargain it away. We saw that example with meat plants. The government really forcefully intervened because of political incentive to ensure that everyone gets as much meat as they're accustomed to. That could very well play out in a future crisis, removing the deterrent effect. So we really want some external body of people who are bringing these lawsuits. I would suggest that shareholders are the natural plaintiffs. In a real sense, directors and officers who fail to take account of these particular risks have let the shareholders down and have failed in a form of duty to the shareholders. Still, we could imagine other kinds of private plaintiffs, key time relators, giving employees additional rights of action that they could pursue in the event of a crisis. The next real question is, what should trigger the liability? My suggestion would be that we should focus on decisions prior to a crisis that rendered the company unable to operate safely at appropriate levels during a crisis. Now, there are obviously a lot of, there's a lot of wiggle room in that particular standard, and we might choose to give that further definition. For example, we might impose a limitation saying that directors and officers only need to concern themselves with crises that could happen with a frequency of about once in a century or more. We could also focus on safe harbors for conduct that complies with regulations that specifically address the risks associated with a pandemic or crisis, unless the directors or officers have some specific knowledge that compliance with the regulation is insufficient. And that again plugs in with an external regulatory strategy. If you create a situation where the directors and officers really want regulations that take account of the potential for a future pandemic or a future crisis, they'll deploy the lobbying strength of the company to get those regulations. Similarly, we could have an exemption to that safe harbor that draws on the personal or private information of the directors and officers. So if the directors and officers know that a regulation is inadequate to address a particular crisis or risk, they have a report on their desk suggesting that, we might say that they don't have the ability to avail themselves of that safe harbor. Next question, what should be the extent of the liability? We wouldn't want it to drown out all of the other important considerations that directors and officers have to weigh. So efficiency is good. Consolidating operations and plants into central plants creates additional efficiencies. There's scale benefits from that. We want that to be on the table. We don't want that consideration to be completely drowned out by the risk of liability in the event of a crisis. So my suggestion would be to limit it to particular years of compensation. So we could say 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years of compensation prior to a crisis would be the limit of the liability for the directors and officers. A related question is indemnification and insurance. Indemnification, I think, would defeat the whole point of selecting directors and officers as the defendants. If the company is indemnifying the directors and officers, then there's just no deterrent effect anymore. Similarly, insurance, could mitigate or reduce the cost or the effectiveness of the deterrence element, but there might be some compensating monitoring benefits. I tend to think that the monitoring benefits are not going to outweigh the benefits of a deterrent scheme, so I would be in favor of banning that as well. But I'm not dogmatic about any of the particular points about the mechanism. My main goal here is to suggest that directors and officers should have a responsibility to think about what's going to happen at their company in the event of a crisis, and to ensure that they're able to continue to fulfill their valuable social function in the event of that crisis. There may be other mechanisms that we ought to explore, such as forcing public disclosure of case rates among employees that could easily serve a valuable function. The key is really to send a message about the responsibility of directors and officers to ensure that businesses can play their role. So with that, I would like to throw the floor open for questions. Questions can be directed to anyone, and if you could just raise your hand when you'd like. Robert Bornholz.
What are tragic choices in the short run often can be avoided by a lot of forethought and large-scale investment. And so a lot of the discussion has been on a trade-off between the safety of lockdown versus liberty. But you could view a large lump of investment and a bigger margin of decision where lockdown is a substitute for containment, where containment can be viewed as a investment in a regime that includes very large-scale testing, contact tracing, support of isolation, quarantine of people entering the community. And that's what some countries have done, Singapore, Taiwan, Vietnam, and they've had hugely lower deaths. But the key thing is, if you view the margin of decision as very large, and that might be somewhat analogous to the systemic versus specific, but if you view the entire regime as a lumpy investment, then you're containing the virus, not the people. The United States actually decided not to do that. The debate over the stimulus package, the administration is rejecting funding for that approach. And so because there's a decision not to contain the virus, it's necessary to contain the people. And so that leads to a lot of short-run trade-offs between lockdown and liberty, but that could be avoided. Of course, there are liberty questions about the containment regime as well. But I wonder why there hasn't been adequate conceptualization about the economies of scale and scope for the kind of containment regime that some countries have done and the United States has chosen not to do.
I'm not sure if Professor Hemel is raising his hand.
One trade-off that we're making is, I don't think it's between lockdown, as stark as between lockdown and liberty. We're choosing a lot of liberty outside of pandemic, and as a result, getting less liberty in pandemic. Whereas Singapore is accepting less liberty outside of pandemic and getting more liberty inside of pandemic. It seems like the societies that have succeeded in really containing the virus while not being islands, while not being New Zealand, have been societies that have accepted much greater surveillance over individuals' lives than we have. And now we're seeing the flip side of that. Now we live less freely than we would in Singapore because we've made that outside of pandemic freedom choice.
Fair point about the overall sort of regulatory philosophy that the two countries have pursued and the direct consequences of that. I'm not seeing any other questions, so maybe I'll just pose one for Professor Casey. So I wanted to tug a little bit on your distinction between economic and financial distress, and in particular thinking about companies that may have value after the pandemic. So you gave the example, for example, of airlines. The planes will still be there in 2022. The pandemic will have passed. Presumably, there'll be pent-up demand for travel. So the real problem is tapping into that future value in order to sustain operations in the interim. Do you conceptualize that as being a financial problem or an economic problem? Do you see this as being a problem for bankruptcy as opposed to settlements?
Yeah, so this I think this ties into why I said the problem is really, the economic distress problem is really for small businesses, less for large businesses. And it gets exactly what you said, that there's an economic distress across the economy in that for 2 months, they were like, it was a real shutdown, or maybe a month, and then it's a partial shutdown for many months. And the airline industry's been hurt, the restaurant industry, those are the ones that come to mind. But like you said, Hertz or United Airlines, they've got maybe they've got a cut to their value by X amount. They've got this big chunk of value that's coming back in the future, and they can finance on that. And ultimately, what happens then is they can go through bankruptcy. Like Hertz goes through bankruptcy, gets financing. They're taking the economic distress. It's not systemic. They're just dealing with it, and then they're using the future value to finance through specific financial distress. And that's why, I think the airline bailout in April made 0 sense, right? There was no systemic reason to do it. And politically and morally, why that's the industry that you're like, that's where we need to put our effort when 30 million people are unemployed. Now, with a small business, it's different because the economic distress there's no value down the road that they can finance from. And so some of the proposals for bankruptcy remedies was, if they file for bankruptcy, we should put a pause on all bills. The problem with the pause is if you don't do business for 6 months and you accrue 6 months of bills, your rent, your interest payments, your employee wages, you're going to then have financial distress when you pick up again. And so then you're like, all right, the pause just puts that down the road and doesn't really, it just shifts economic distress to financial distress. And then other versions were, make the banks not collect. And the worry there, which might be a solution for some firms, you don't want to push the distress one level up in the economy, right? There's levers you want to be careful that you pull. So I think that answers, but really it's very different for large companies, for small companies, because of that future value you can borrow on.
Does that suggest, though, that if part of your goal is to sort of preserve that future value, you're talking about the example of firms that sort of dissolve and then need to be reconstituted after the crisis and the destruction of value inherent in that. Does that suggest, though, that if you're trying to identify those firms that will be like that, that maybe bankruptcy is the right place for it, and perhaps injecting liquidity there is a good way of sort of identifying those firms? Yeah.
So one argument along those lines were, how do we identify firms that either need economic distress relief or financial distress relief? And let's say it's systemic. Somebody says, if they file for bankruptcy, we know. The argument for that is, if we are going to try to select, we might want a costly signal. Bankruptcy, filing Chapter 11 is a costly signal. We'll know you're really in distress. The argument against that, it's kind of where I ended on. Overwhelmingly, small businesses that go into Chapter 11 don't come out. And if you're saying we've got a systemic problem at small and mid-sized businesses, and we're going to create a gatekeeper, which is filing for bankruptcy, you're going to get them very late in the process, and you're going to be forcing firms that don't need to file to go through that process, hire bankruptcy lawyers. It adds this cost that I think the more direct subsidy to a certain size of business is going to be a much cleaner, more efficient version of the same outcome. We want to get money to the firms that need it. We might overpay in the version where it's industry wide, we go to a few firms that aren't in distress. I think the cost of that is much less than pushing all firms who need it into bankruptcy.
Thank you. My question is for Professor Abramowicz. First, thank you for coming. Appreciated your presentation. I'm just curious because you seem to suggest that if this livelihood insurance is ever going to get off the ground, it would take some substantial government involvement in some means, whether it's subsidies or providing data or whatever. So I'm curious then, what would then the advantage be of then letting these private insurers then take on the rest of it, rather than the government centralizing it and offering some sort of government centralized insurance? Or is there none? Is the point just to have some insurance? I was wondering if, considering all the extra steps that might be taken, what added benefit would there be for private insurers to come on, rather than just saying that the government should take on this responsibility itself for future pandemics?
Yes, that's a great question. So, to some, part of my argument, I think, is to say, look, this is pretty simple insurance. I mean, it doesn't require a whole lot of, underwriting, a lot of kind of ex post adjudication. So a lot of what we pay insurance companies for traditionally kind of becomes irrelevant here. So we end up with kind of a pretty, what should be, one hopes, a pretty low cost insurance product. And so I think the thrust of your question is to say, well, if we're going to do that, why not just have the government offer it itself? And, I think that's possible down the line, especially if you coupled it with some sort of useful informational mechanisms. I think the argument against that, or at least the argument for allowing people to purchase privately, is that I think once the government is involved, it starts to become a political calculus how much people should pay for the insurance, right? And so the idea that I have with the private insurance is to, potentially provide a kind of market signal. So if you think about the drivers for Uber, for example, maybe they start to get a market signal when they realize the insurance that, will pay them if Uber drivers overall are losing income costs a lot of money, right? I mean, it might start to say, why is that? Maybe it's because people think, maybe this isn't what would happen, but maybe this is because people think driverless cars are actually going to take off and they're not going to need the drivers anymore. And so, I think if government is doing it, the chance that the government actually prices it in an actuarially fair way is probably a little bit reduced. On the other hand, maybe it becomes a little bit easier to kind of provide consumers information about the product in that case. I don't think there is this middle ground where the government can serve a kind of relatively minimal role of kind of sponsoring these market mechanisms that provide people information about expected the distribution of expected payouts for different insurance policies rather than offering the policies themselves.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Hi, I have a question for Professor Casey, if you don't mind. Are you seeing right now sort of an increase in companies that are capitalizing on these small businesses that are starting to go bankrupt or who are going bankrupt? And as in, like, these financially safe companies are able to, or new companies are able to even pop up and just sort of capitalize on the fact that others need this liquidation and need money quickly, so they become subsidiaries of something larger. And then if this is something that's either coming up or is presently happening, is this going to be like an issue of there's a increased consolidation and sort of more chain sort of things are going to be popping up, or is this a solution possibly for some of these struggling small businesses?
Yeah, so I don't think we haven't seen that, and there's a couple parts to it, right? So when I say the wave hasn't come, there hasn't been there's been a looked like a decrease, now looks steady to the filings of small and medium business. They haven't started filing more than they did before the pandemic, and individuals are actually filing less. But there are some economic studies coming out now that say that there are businesses that are now gone, but they're just gone, right? And part of it is when there was no demand, it wasn't like your restaurant shut down. A large restaurant isn't going to come and take the space because it's not going to be valuable until after the demand is back. So we haven't seen that. Now, I think you're right to say, as a general matter in the economy, like Amazon is growing, and that's probably going to be an effect of this. Like larger companies are more able to function in certain types of distress, and I think in certain industries we will see that. But I have not seen the data that's already happening, and part of it is the wave hasn't come, right? So it might be when all these companies disappear and then we reopen, if we don't do anything about it, yeah, like large chains might be like, well, your local coffee shop is gone, Starbucks will fill it, right? That certainly is a plausible outcome, but Starbucks is waiting because their stores are still shut down, right? Where I live, the Starbucks shut down, and it'll probably come back in a while, but they're not going to fill the local spots until they fill their own spots, but they might, when this is all over, be much larger.
Professor Abramowicz, I had one other question for you. From a practical perspective, do you see these products as really being available to the people who are most hurt by these kinds of dislocations? And sort of relatedly, one of the concerns is really just getting money into the hands of people who would otherwise sort of go out and work very quickly, as Professor Hemel, I think, highlighted. Doesn't it suggest that we shouldn't be eager to put this responsibility in the hands of sort of insurers who, whenever you deal with an insurance company, there's sort of a Kafkaesque process of trying to get money out of them. Are you concerned about that issue here? If not,
yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that results from the fundamental design of insurance. And I think the fundamental design of insurance, ultimately is, everything's in the shadow of this eventual adjudication about the individual. What is the individual's loss? And then obviously other questions such as, did the individual commit fraud when purchasing the insurance and the like? And I think all that goes away with this kind of more general type of insurance where it's based on an index, right? And I think when Schiller, I mean, to the extent Schiller has, I didn't talk about this in the talk, but has kind of realized his vision. It wasn't so much with livelihood insurance as much as with kind of these derivative products on housing values in particular areas. And so, when you think of it more as almost, it's kind of a market, people are buying on both sides of the market. It can serve an insurance function, but the market should clear very well. Now, I think when you look at that, I mean, he's realized his vision and that these are sold. Very few people actually buy them. There's just not a whole lot of people actually insuring against the possibility that their region is going to sort of have decreasing home values, relative to the rest of the country. But I think these markets can clear relatively effectively if you don't have sort of some big adjudication question about, well, did this person, could this person have become a grocery delivery person? No, if you do that, forget it. And I think that's why the public insurance response has been, okay, we just need a super simple formula. Well, you can have a simple formula that's based on ex ante choices of kind of which livelihood to claim. And so that's why I'm not too worried about those costs. It's a good question. Thank you.
Professor Hemel, I have a question here from the Legal Forum staff. Just noting that your abstract pointed out that expectations about pandemic length are the key factor in distancing decisions, and asking whether that implies that incentivization for stay-at-home orders should be front-loaded so that the benefits are highest when the uncertainty is highest.
It's a great question. And it seems like most of us are distancing less as the pandemic goes on. Part of that's because, which is the opposite of what we should be doing. We now have information that we should update our value of PD, our probability of getting the virus if we distance, if we haven't gotten the virus yet, and the pandemic is 9 months in. One way of explaining that is just it's pandemic fatigue overriding rationality. The other is, and I think this is still rational, it's just we're updating our expectations rationally. I didn't think in March that we would be doing this on Zoom in November. I mean, thinking back to the planning of the conference, we were still kind of unsure in the spring whether we would be able to bring people to Chicago. And I think probably as the pandemic has gone on, most of us, our estimate of how long it will last has been increasing rather than decreasing. So if we had accurate expectations at the beginning, then I think the policy prescription follows. But I think most of us, myself included, had way over optimistic expectations at the beginning. It's good over optimism. We probably did a better job of distancing at the beginning because we thought that this would be just a brief flash.
It'll disappear like a miracle in the summer. So we all stay home. I think we're almost out of time, so maybe I'll just thank each of the panelists. Unless there are any further questions. Oh.
Professor Hemel, along those lines about expectations and rationalizing behavior, I was really thinking about a lot of the research around the Federal Reserve Board and their policy pronouncements and how that affects business expectations. To what extent does your paper consider the effect of people's expectations about the credibility of these pronouncements, and then also about the capacity to enact that announcement? So for instance, we might have thought at the beginning of the pandemic that Trump was serious and had good faith to say that the pandemic would end in 2 weeks. And then once that expectation didn't arise, how does our change in our view of these announcements affect our behavior? Because you could plausibly say that because we have no faith in the government now, we have unreasonably extended our expectations, even though there is good evidence saying that there might be a vaccine which ends this pandemic in the spring.
Yeah, I don't know how to manage a pandemic so that people always have optimistic expectations about when it will end. And I would think that that would be, that probably lying to the American people is generally a bad thing, even though in a partial equilibrium analysis, it will occasionally be a good thing. I think the analogy to the Fed is great, that the charge of the CDC is in many respects similar to the charge of the Fed. And thinking back to February or March, it was an asymmetric. There were risks on both sides. I.e., if we had clamped down very quickly for COVID-19 and then the virus had never come, then our ability to respond aggressively to the Nipah virus when it comes in a few years might have been compromised. So there's this sort of the temporal challenges that the Fed faces are similar in many ways to the temporal challenges that the CDC faces. I think maybe, especially those who are coming to this panel, so thinking about economic policy, there's a great paper to be written about what the CDC can learn from the Fed. The Fed is an institution that I think has come out of this crisis looking a lot better, and the CDC has been looking a lot worse. And perhaps part of that is simply removed from partisan politics, but maybe there are other lessons that public health authorities can take from the success of monetary policy.
Well, it's easy to be popular when you're throwing money at people, but hard to be popular when you're telling people to stay home. So still probably a good paper to be written. With that, I will thank our panelists. Thank you for your wonderful contributions. And looking forward to the other panels today. Thank you.
Thanks you, everyone. Thank you, Professors Abramowicz, Hemel, Casey, and Kovvali. We're now going to take a break for lunch, and we will come back promptly at 1 p.m. for a Q&A with Chief Judge Rebecca Pallmeyer. Have some fun, not on Zoom.